Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, this time on the always interesting world of sanctions and export controls. In the last few years, governments have been increasingly willing to impose sanctions and export controls as geopolitical tensions rise, international conflicts look more likely, and there's an increasing focus on protecting a country's trade defense. Today, we bring you a free webinar from the Chartered Institute of Export and International Trade in association with Womble Bond Dickinson to help you get up to speed on the trade landscape and also to protect your business. My name is Phil Abnett and I'm a senior content editor here at the Chartered Institute, but it's my delight to have with me three of the most foremost export control experts we have available. First, we have Andy Bridges from the Chartered Institute of Export and International Trade. Andy, how are you?
Hi, Phil. Yeah, good. Thank you. Yourself?
Right, lovely to hear from you in a second. And shortly we'll be hearing from Alan Elson and Ashley Borthwick, two senior partners at Womble Bond Dickinson. Ashley represents the UK side and represents the US side. Hello, both. Welcome to the webinar. How are you doing?
Good afternoon. Oh, good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Fantastic. We'll hear from them in a second. Just before we do, however, we're going to launch the first of our polls and go through one of our housekeeping notes. So I believe the first poll will be turning up in the chat now. And that is, how confident are you in your internal customs compliance processes, particularly as it relates to export controls? Very confident, somewhat confident, slightly unconfident, very unconfident, or not sure. While we run through that should be turning up now. Couple housekeeping notes. Firstly, we'll have a live Q&A section. Please do drop any questions you have in the Q&A function. However, just to be aware, this isn't if you keep things as brief as possible and not too company or sector specific, it helps me make as many of them available to as many people as possible. And it also means that shorter questions are just a bit easier for me to read out as well. We will be sharing the recording with you. We'll also be hosting the recording on the site. So do keep an eye out on the Chartered Institute's insights and website pages. I'm just the results are with us now. So interestingly, 46% say they're somewhat confident, with another 25% saying they're very confident. Only about 4% said they're very unconfident, the remaining hovering between. Andy, Ashley, and Alan, is that sort of what we expect at this stage, or we expect a bit more or less confidence?
Personally, I'm not overly surprised. I mean, with the amount of changes that are happening on the compliance front and what we have to do now to ensure that we're compliant, but particularly when we're exporting overseas, I'm not overly surprised. I know a lot of companies are actually putting a lot of effort into ensuring their compliance and not only that, maintaining their compliance. So yeah, I'm not overly surprised.
Thank you, Andy. Okay, if we could just close the poll down for a second. I'm going to hand over to Andy, who's going to give a quick scene setter before we go into a more in-depth conversation with Alan and Ashley. Andy, over to you.
Thanks very much, Phil. Welcome, everybody. So, yeah, setting the scene. So, sanctions. What can we say about sanctions that probably hasn't already been said over the past 3 to 4 years? But saying that, since Brexit, the UK pretty much steadily built out on its independent sanctions regime under the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act 2018. The pace of the designation and the regulatory innovation has accelerated due to mostly in response to Russia's ongoing war against the Ukraine. And just to give you a few figures regarding that, February 2025, this year alone, the UK actually implemented its largest sanctions package since 2022. 107 new designations just against Russian military supply chains, against the oligarchs, the financiers, and the foreign financial institutions. far surpassing anything that has been released in one hit before. Followed very quickly in May this year, another historic package emerged, this time targeting over 100 vessels from what we call the Russian Shadow Fleet and related entities. And what we're trying to do there, or what OFSI is trying to do there, is a clear effort to try and reduce Moscow's ability to use, what's the word, opaque maritime logistics. But it's not only that. Geopolitically, the UK's approach has also been thematic as well. So there's also the Magnet Sky style designations against human rights-based asset freezes, sanctions addressing forced labour. They are now all staples and quite common sanctions that are being introduced by the powers that be in the United Kingdom. And it's not just in the United Kingdom. United Nations, they're implementing sanctions. The US is implementing sanctions. The EU, and we've still got a very good relationship with all of those entities with regards to sanctions. We don't follow them all, obviously. We have got our own way of going forward. And as I say, but what we do is try and support where we can, if we can. OFSI, basically, they are transitioning from a softer stance to a very much more assertive stance, following a US-style enforcement regime. Again, 2025 alone, OFSI, the Office of Financial Sanctions Institute, they have issued £5,000 civil penalties against various shipping companies, basically for failing to comply with requested information or information requests. It's the first time the United Kingdom has actually undertaken anything like this along those lines. Some of the high-profile fines, almost £500,000, have been imposed against companies that have got outreach, or they've got relatives or relations to some of the, how can I put it, Russian unnamed regulatory entities with regards penalties for association or misassociation. So that said, if you compare that United Kingdom with the United States and the United Nations context, although the UK has gone its own way, we're very much not alone. As I said, again, mid-2025, this is all 2025 information. Global sanctions entities in the United States climbed to 80,000 entities. That's a 17% increase on last year. Over 300 separate national sanctions regimes exist worldwide, yet only 1 or 2% originate from within the United Nations Security Council resolutions. So you can see, even though we're all pulling together, we've still got a long way to go. That said, what can we do? Implications that are there for us as trade professionals. Compliance is no longer an option. It is absolutely mandatory that we now focus and look at compliance, and we bring more compliance into a mandatory state. Due diligence. Okay, that's the big one. Due diligence. The due diligence itself will drive compliancy. If we can all get along the lines of ensuring that we know what our product is, who we're selling our product to, make sure we've got these end user undertakings or end user and stockist undertakings done and in place, it's going to make things easier for everybody. But again, with all that, we do still need to have some sort of governance framework. It must evolve. So I would think personally, we should be expecting demands for a stronger internal reporting, stronger settlement readiness, and certainly much clearer information transparency going forward into 2026. Apart from that, it's not really much else I could add, but as I say, the UK has very much elevated our sanctions and export controls from policy tools to a more strategic trade infrastructure. The scale has been invigorating. We have reached new heights, but I think the message I'm trying to get across now is that compliance is no longer optional. It should be more mandatory than optional areas of compliance. We should really have a lot more mandatory compliance in place. Thanks, Phil.
No worries. Thank you, Andy, for the quick scene setter. We're going to go to the next stage of this session, which is a conversation with Alan and Ashley. So if you can bring them to the stage. Welcome both. So obviously we have Alan representing the US side, Ashley representing the UK side, different perspectives there. I guess my first question would be, so some of the changes that have come along as a result of ITAR and the EAR, if I get the first of today's acronyms in, there's obviously some expansions of it, we're seeing some changes. Yeah, could you give us a quick sort of update on what we've seen over the last year and what we're expecting to see in the future?
Yes, thanks, Phil. I would say that as far as ITAR and EAR, and for the audience that may not be familiar, I mean, one of the key things in the U.S. export controls is what we call jurisdiction classification. It is the absolute threshold issue because in the U.S. we have really a trifurcated export control system between defense, energy, and then everything else in the dual use side. And so the dual use is the EAR, the defense sector being the ITAR. And because there has been a concerted effort really since 2009 to push as many things off of the U.S. munitions list, which is what's controlled under the ITAR, over to the dual use side, therefore making it, frankly, more exportable. Because of that, the importance is always placed, and the threshold issue, like I said, is on jurisdiction and classification. The jurisdiction being who controls my commodity, my software, my technology, my services, if they're controlled. Is it the State Department under the ITAR? Is it the Commerce Department under the EAR? Is it the Energy Department or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for those types of items? And so without that, you really can't know who controls it or how it's controlled. And the main takeaway from that, I would say, particularly to a predominantly non-US audience, is that be wary of using common sense and logic when determining which one of those you fall under. It's very, very counterintuitive in some cases. Things that you would think are under the ITAR are not, and vice versa, particularly when you get into the high tech areas. So you have to dive in up front. Better to do that than when you get a knock at the door from the enforcement side. But I think you're going to see a continuation, even under this administration, of pushing things off of the U.S. munitions list. You're going to see programs like AUKUS between Australia, UK, US, which we may touch on later, designed to bring those ITAR barriers down, because the ITAR, even though there is a tremendous aspect of extraterritoriality in U.S. export controls and particularly U.S. economic sanctions, it's still something that the ITAR is more prohibitive. There are fewer carve-outs, fewer exemptions, and things like that. So, the key advice we always give to clients is put some time into that jurisdiction classification and get away from the ITAR as fast as you can, if possible. So, I'll leave it at that.
So, Ashley, how much sense and logic is it on the UK side?
Well, there is some logic to it. I'm not sure about the sense. I'll leave that to politicians. But yeah, I mean, the poll at the start was really interesting because you've got a sophisticated audience that know the basics of export control and sanctions well. And I think that's because, as Andy mentioned, the legislation at framework level has been quite stable. So you mentioned the Export Control Act 2022, Export Control Order. The principles there are fairly embedded, and perhaps it's worth me just elaborating on some of those just to cover the basics, because it's often what you don't know that's a problem than what you do. And just discussing with Alan, because the US side, it seems to me there's so many different facets, so many different avenues you can go down. Whereas in sort of my logic, at least, if you focus on just the goods or whatever it is you want to export, that could be goods, could be software or technology. And it's often that sort of software and technology piece that gets missed. But everyone will be familiar with the military list. Is it in there? If not, is it a dual use item? And by that, I mean, is it an item that has both a civil and a potential military application? But then there's the sort of catch-all. Even if what you would like to export isn't on the military list, isn't on the dual use list, you've got to then consider, well, who's the ultimate end user? And again, it may be caught, and you may need a license if, for example, the ultimate end user could be a research facility for a government in an embargoed country, for example. So it goes back to Andy's point about due diligence. You really do have to know exactly who will ultimately be using the goods, software, technology. I guess that's the export control order, and there are other restrictions around trading, brokering deals overseas in certain types of military items, etc. But I guess one of the bigger changes is the country-specific regulations, and Russia's a good example. I mean, in addition to the export control order, there are numerous and ever-growing restrictions under that particular set of regulations. They're extraordinarily broad, covering everything from luxury handbags to steel. The breadth is enormous. So it's worth bearing that in mind, and the list keeps growing, which emphasises the need to keep up to speed with this fast-paced area. And again, Alan and I were discussing terminology, and trade control, sanctions can often be used interchangeably, but you've also got to think of the financial sanctions which attach to entities, and the most common being asset freezes. And we often have issues where, when you're looking at who you may be doing business with and who is in the supply chain, it's not always obvious, and it'd be quite difficult actually to understand who it is you're dealing with. And even if you think who's actually pulling the strings behind the scene. And I suspect we'll come on to that later with, well, from a lawyer's perspective, what does good look like in that situation? So fairly stable, I think, Phil, but an ever-growing list of restrictions.
So kind of to get the compare and contrast aspect, what has been the main difference between how the US imposed their sanctions? This is how the UK has imposed their sanctions, most notably in Russia, but a variety of other countries as well.
Yeah, I'll take that from the U.S. side first. I mean, one of the things to remember about U.S. economic sanctions, which I think if we're talking about a parallel terminology, what you guys call the financial sanctions, essentially, for the most part, the U.S. regulator at the Treasury Department, Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, the opposite number to OFSI. They're OFSI and OFAC are in lockstep in many regimes across the world. However, there's no doubt and no secret to anybody in the audience, the U.S. has a massive proliferation of sanctions programs. As a matter of fact, last time I checked, there are 40 separate sanctions programs that OFAC maintains. And not all of them have regs, by the way. Most of them do, but keeps it a little bit unique. But they're driven by there's some are list-based sanctions, some are activity-based sanctions, some are sectoral-based sanctions. Some are outright prohibitions on who you can deal with. Some are investment restrictions, particularly in the sectoral side. And so it's really a mishmash. We say it's the hardest part for, I think, global businesses to get their hands around are the U.S. economic sanctions threat. And, it's driven by the power of the U.S. dollar and global, in global, trade. That's why the U.S. can extraterritorially project its sanctions power, and it does, much to the dislike of many global businesses that are trying to navigate those. And I think that's what makes it so difficult, is that it's not always easy to get a straight answer. And oftentimes you have competing sanctions programs, one that may hit an activity, that may hit a geography and a sector you're dealing with, and you have to reconcile those.
Just to quickly dive in, could you give us an example of the scale of the US's extrajudicial extraterritoriality? Sort of scope. like how deep can they go?
Yeah, well, I mean, what the U.S. will do is, if it is in particular, and this is not talking about secondary sanctions, which you may have heard those in the news related to Russian oil trade and the threat of the U.S. to put those sanctions in place with anybody that's buying Russian oil, then that they would be cut off from the dollar, essentially cut off from the U.S. financial system. That's a pretty big stick, and it's easy to talk about, harder to implement, I think. So I'm going to distinguish secondary sanctions from what usually happens is that, let's say you have a designated party on the U.S. The ultimate sanctions list in the U.S. is the Specially Designated Nationals and Blocked Persons list, or the SDN list. If you have a party under an that's an SDN, then U.S. persons are prohibited from interacting with that party, and actually have an obligation to seize any assets they come in control of that party. And so that makes it very, very tricky. And so what we see pragmatically is that, friendly trading nations to the U.S. also wind up treating that as if, passing the sanction through, because they don't want to get in the middle of a transaction that OFAC is hot about. So you'll see that that extraterritorial projection of powers, particularly in the financial sector, where banks will just say, yes, we probably could find a way to process that lawfully, but it's too much of a leap. We're not going to do it. And so you see a pragmatic, stagnation of trade related to U.S. sanctions targets. That's the main impact I see of on a daily basis, really, in global trade.
We also talked recently, Alan, because we had a situation where there's a potential machine or component, and on the face of it, it's, looked fine, UK to say China, for example, but actually, given what you said about sort of the extra territorial reach, it sort of emphasized the importance of knowing exactly what technology is in those machines, because, like we mentioned, ITAR as one example, and if it is caught by US sanctions, essentially the US want to know where that technology or whatever it may be is at any given point in time, which I think is a major difference, and it, again, emphasizes the level of due diligence required. Even if it doesn't, on the face of it, involve the US, it may do because of technology. And I guess microchips are a really good example of where that may crop up in practice.
Yeah, I would say in response to that, I mean, probably I think the easiest way to look at the U.S. extraterritorial projection is more in the export control side than it even is in the sanction side. The sanction side, it wields its power because people don't want to be cut off from the U.S. dollar. On the export control side, it gets a little bit more, I think, counterintuitive in that, like Ash just said, you may have an item that is lawfully exported to the UK or Germany or France or, a NATO ally, maybe even without a license, or, maybe through an ITAR exemption even, but that country, can't turn around and allow the export of it without permission. Well, it hardly ever can under the ITAR. It can under the EAR, and it goes back to your original question. That's one of the reasons why you want to get away from the ITAR, is that the more exemptions, are available. And so one not fun fact I will throw out here that because I think it's relevant to a lot of things that companies are dealing with when it comes to semiconductors, and particularly in the, as the AI boom is continuing to go on and semiconductors are more and more a part of the conversation. To put it bluntly, the U.S. Commerce Department, which is where most semiconductors are regulated under the EAR because they're dual use just by design, but the U.S. can assert jurisdiction over pretty much every semiconductor on the planet based on the foreign direct product rules, which is a special place for export control hell, as we say, to have to get into. Very, 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 complex and convoluted, but that's probably the most brash example of extraterritoriality I can think of in the U.S. system, and it hits the most under the semiconductor side because of the underlying technology that goes into making a product wherever it's made. So that's again, back to the whole aspect of there being some counterintuitive aspects of this whole area.
Ashley, so we've heard a lot about the US side. How has the UK been approaching its, particularly Russian sanctions, obviously massive expansion there, but the general sanction regime, how has that sort of changed over the last 6 to 8 months?
My view might be slightly skewed because I'm in a position where people tend to come to me when things haven't gone so well. But I think it is fair to say that there's been an uptick in enforcement action. And I guess it's not surprising when you read about, an analysis of, for example, drones used in battle in, say, Ukraine at the moment. And it's found that the component parts are sourced from the EU, and they should never, that shouldn't have happened. So I guess there's two things going on from my perspective. One is a much heavier focus on anti-evasion, which in essence boils down to making sure goods don't get into the wrong hands, and the various regimes are not sidestepped. And in that respect, there's some updated guidance to help businesses, and essentially there are different levels of due diligence, and most of the audience will be aware that there are certain goods that are deemed more valuable to the Russian government because they have sort of particular application, military uses at the moment, and a lot of that's around heavy machinery, electronics, things like that. And where you're dealing with those higher priority goods, then you need to have much more enhanced due diligence. And you've got the regulator OTC, not OFC, which it came into being last year, and its remit really is to clamp down on overseas dealings that contravene sanctions. So a focus on anti-evasion, and I think Andy touched on it in his opening, like the number of penalties and the size of the penalties have increased significantly. And one big difference is the fact that you don't always need to show that you intended to breach the trade controls. Some are strict liability, so it's a case of did you comply, yes or no? If the answer to that is no, there's much more likelihood of a financial penalty, and quite a sizable one, which never used to be the case.
I was going to say, didn't we have the first £1 million fine fairly recently?
When I was sort of preparing, I did find some sort of fairly hefty examples, and there was a £3.2 million fine.
Oh, wow.
That was levied by HMRC. That's unlicensed exports of military goods, so towards the top end of the sort of seriousness scale, I guess. But yeah, I mean, there's the ability to name and shame as well, and obviously are not shy, and even relatively minor breaches. I mean, one of the banks was fined like £250, but named and shamed because its compliance team didn't work the weekend, and the designation happened, and they weren't able to process that fast enough. So an individual was able to take out some money when they shouldn't have been able to do so. So much more visible and much more an appetite to enforce.
Thanks to Ashley. So just on the enforcement side, one of the articles we wrote for Daily Update a few months ago was on the change the US's approach to export controls and sanctions, and a sort of changing attitude towards enforcement. Alan, what have you been seeing in terms of enforcement from the new administration over the last, well, I guess we're up on 11 months now. What have you seen over the last year or so in terms of enforcement?
Sure. I will say it's on the export control side in particular, you see a bit of a change in that, and it started actually in the last administration at the Office of Export Enforcement, the dual use enforcement side under Commerce. The Assistant Secretary there was a DOJ veteran and started a program that, or a series of programs that really took the emphasis more toward using the assets of the enforcement side to go after the better targets and the more serious criminal side. So what we've seen, and I have to say that even though this is a very different administration, in this respect, you're seeing the same type of continuation. You're just seeing it targeted a bit differently. And so the general theme was, okay, we're going to, not worry about, grabbing a small civil fine here and there over somebody who, had a technical misstep or something like that. Now that's not the same thing as Ash was just talking about, where you miss a designation. This is just on the export side, because the U.S. has typically approached all of these sanctions and export controls as strict liability in theory. But the main enforcement trend, I would say, is that they are, even though fines are still happening, they happen all the time. It's not a revenue raising thing, and they're putting their assets more toward, let's find those cases where there is intent, and let's prosecute those and going after them. So you've seen foreign military procurement networks are still very viable targets. This administration has moved a little bit away from that aspect and more toward the narco trafficking, more toward things that I would say are this hemisphere, the U.S. or the North America, South America. So a lot more narco trafficking ties in with the concern about the fentanyl trade into the U.S., that type of thing. So that's just a very high level change. But in general, we do still see, the idea, essentially we say DOJ, Department of Justice, has been awakened, and where it's now not just the export control regulators themselves, but it's every federal jurisdiction in the United States looking for these types of cases to prosecute, not to have a civil fine, but to actually have a criminal conviction. And so that raises the stakes dramatically for exporters, just in the mentality of compliance.
Thanks for that. As you said, very high level update. It's interesting to hear that they're increasing into the criminal, not just civil sanctions. So we've already got a question on one of these topics. I'm just going to bring that in quick before we get to the Q&A. What's the importance, do you think, for both of you, of sort of getting the dual use / military classification right? Because it sounds like quite a big issue at the moment.
Absolutely. First and foremost, you're liable to potential criminal prosecution. It's never a good thing. And if it's not that, a significant monetary penalty, and it's not great for trade. It's likely, you won't have many friends in that situation, and/or your goods may be seized. So it's just a couple from my perspective.
Yeah, and I would say that in terms of as I've said at the outset, the jurisdiction classification is everything in the U.S. What we often see, unfortunately, is particularly with fairly new U.S. government contractors, they will be lured into what we term ITAR by convenience, which I realize is a very ironic term phrase itself. But, sometimes you'll have contracting officers just say, you know what, it's easier to do the ITAR because, you have to ask for a license for anything. However, you're throwing yourself in the briar patch, so to speak, because, it's also much more prohibitive in what you can do, what non-U.S. parties would want to do in terms of, joint ventures or participation. And so, that's why, again, it sounds self-serving for lawyers to say this, but we do say that, it's by far the best trade for companies to take that time, look at that jurisdiction and classification, and do everything you can to try to, at least in the U.S. system, you can do many different pathways to try to get a lower classification. I say lower classification, a less burdensome classification. Obviously, that doesn't mean that there's an end around or some kind of evasion or circumvention aspect to it. It's just a matter of really digging into the technical aspects, the specifications, and determining, does this really warrant the higher level of control? And so, again, you've heard me mention it about 3 or 4 times now, just in this short time we've been together. That is why it's always worth your time and effort to try to get the jurisdiction over to the civil side, the dual use side, as well as the classification as low as possible, so that you can do more with a U.S. controlled product around the world.
Thank you, Alan. So I'm just going to give Alan Ashley a quick break before we go to the Q&A section. And while I launch the second of our polls today, this one is which continents do you have significant trade with? Multiple options here: Europe, South America, North America, Africa, Asia, or Oceania. So yeah, if you could just drop that in, just give us your honest feedback there. And before I bring everyone back in, we have a couple of questions, one from Sylvia and one from Sam. I know there's been a comment asking for people's contact details. So we did flash them up on screen. And I hope everyone's taking notes. And just a reminder, we will be sharing the recording later on once the session is done. But with all that out the way, I'd just like to bring back Ashley, Andy, and Alan for the Q&A section. Again, please feel free to drop in some questions. We've got about 10 more minutes, so it's a good chance to ask of our experts questions on dual use and export controls. So the first one we have, I'm going to ask Sam's first because he asked that earliest. How can SMEs assess the adequacy of their internal due diligence processes to ensure they're fit to purpose? And is there a reasonable standard order against? Would anyone like to pick that one up first? Andy, you're on mute.
Sorry, Phil. Can you say that again? I didn't quite
No
catch.
problem. How can SMEs assess the adequacy of their internal due diligence processes to ensure they are fit for purpose while remaining proportionate to the scale of their operations?
Yeah, I mean, I personally think everybody's going to be a little bit different on this. But the one thing I've always said, the larger companies, they've got, and again, I'm not trying to upset anybody, but the larger companies, they've got the budgets, they've got the staff that can do this and they can focus on this on a daily basis. The SMEs, they haven't got that luxury. They haven't got the luxury of having dedicated departments. Some haven't even got dedicated staff, but they have people with experience. So I suppose the best way to go about judging it is certainly go on to gov.uk, take a look on there and take a look about, you take a look at the processes that are required to keep yourself compliant. It is the Bible. Everybody can see on there exactly what you need to do to keep yourself compliant. But with regards to due diligence, you do really need to have somebody that is a subject matter expert on your product, somebody who knows your product inside out. You also need to ensure that, as I said earlier on, with regards end user undertakings or end user and stockist undertakings, you do need to know who you're selling to, and not only that, now you need to understand who they could be selling to as well. So it's taking it to the next degree, and this is going to come from experience and from practice and from for implementing best practice. So I would suggest at the moment, to ensure that you're doing the right things in the right order, that you speak to a consultancy company, speak to somebody else in the industry, speak to sister companies, speak to other companies that are in the same industry. What have you done? What are you doing? How are you approaching this? There's no written standard operating procedure for actually doing it and to follow it, and for implementing these rules, but it will come with experience. And say with the experience, you'll do the due diligence. With the due diligence, you'll drive your own compliance. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that.
I was just going to say, it's a common question that we have because there isn't a one size fits all solution, and some SMEs are highly specialist and may produce parts that are of very much of military interest, in which case the level of due diligence may actually be much higher than perhaps a larger company selling lower risk goods. So it really, like you said, Andy, you really need that technical know-how about how is your product classified, and that will dictate the risk and what you need to do. And it's just about knowing exactly what your supply chain is doing and getting comfortable with that. And I guess a lawyer's got to say this, but you've got to document it, because if you don't document things it is very hard to convince somebody that you have taken checks. So just keep a note.
Totally agree.
And I can just pipe in from the U.S. side. It's very similar in methodology. You know, we always recommend, especially to smaller companies who, again, usually have tremendous expertise and very, high-level products themselves, but just everybody's wearing 5 hats, trying to do different jobs on the compliance side. You know, an internal audit is a must. What we kind of call an external audit, and I'm talking about an informal audit, not necessarily formal with the accountants or anything, but the consultants, lawyers, experts that can get in and really help. Hey, are you hitting the mark, or is the mark getting past you here? And then on occasion, as crazy as this may sound, we have clients that will want to reach out to the government, not so much on the ITAR side, but on the EAR side, to reach out to the regulators themselves and the Office of Export Enforcement in particular. And it's kind of a build some goodwill with the regulator. Now, again, you have to be very careful if you're going to that step, but sometimes it pays off. The other thing I will mention here, because many companies will see this as it's just another cost center I have to absorb. It's another thing that I have to do. We've also found that a lot of opportunities do arise because it forces a company to really dig in and analyze their product from an angle that they probably haven't before. And suddenly they may realize there are different markets that their product would apply to. There are different, sales opportunities. And in that regard, of course, as lawyers, we always like to not just be an added cost burden, but to somehow help companies find new markets. And so that's another I think part of the equation that needs to be thought about.
Thanks, everyone. Sam, I hope that answers your question. We've only got about 3 or so minutes left, so I'm going to Sylvia's question now. Always pleasure to hear from you, Sylvia. So I'm gonna go to the more general aspect of the question. Can you share some of the best practice around jurisdiction classifications for export control purposes? Is anyone in a position to answer that? So I'll read out the full one. Can you possibly share some of the best practices around EU dual use classifications, or if it's too specific, just generally around jurisdiction classifications for export controls purposes? Does anyone want to answer either of those 2 questions, either the specific one or the general one?
I don't mind. I'll go. I can lead off if you like. Best practice. Okay, so you need to start at the basics. Again, you need to know your product. You need to know who you're selling to. The big rule here from the United Kingdom point of view, probably from the United States as well, is that if you are a producer or a manufacturer of military equipment, as a contractor, a civilian contractor, the chances are that you're going to need an OGEL, and you need to apply for a license through the existing SPIRE system. I'm sure everybody's aware by now that we've now implemented, or ECJU have implemented, a new digital system called LIGHT, which is they're transitioning across to over the next couple of years. So dual use items, very much, probably about 90–95% of dual use items will be going down that route where you'll apply for a license through the LIGHT system. So the first thing you need to do basically is ensure that you've got access to both of those systems. You need to ensure that you, as I said before, know your product inside out. Make sure that when you make your application for a license, you've got the accurate entire specification details for that item, because that is going to determine what ECJU send back to you, how they're going to communicate back to you. Is it going to be a military item? Is it going to be a dual use item? If it's military, it stays military. Pretty much the same as I would imagine, Alan, that if it's ITAR, it stays ITAR, doesn't it? Very much so. I know it can change, but very difficult. And if it's dual use, it stays dual use. You can't move across into the military side of things. So the basics would be is to know your product, know what you're applying for, and as I say, the basics would be ensure that you've got your SPIRE application or your Spire account up to date and make sure that you've registered for the new light system. From there, it is pretty self-explanatory. You can only go at that pace then, particularly now with the new light system. So it will tell you what you need to do to ensure that you're applying for and you're being compliant with an application for a license, particularly on dual use at the moment.
Thanks, Andy. We're already at time, but Ashley or Alan, anything you'd like to add on that, or do you want to leave that there?
I was just going to emphasize it's a really technical question, so you really do need to know your product inside and out. That's my only point.
Yeah, and I'll say from the U.S. side, I agree with everything that Andy and Ashley just said. The other aspect to look at, I mean, because it really is a technical dive, and we start from the standpoint of no one is going to know the product better than the company who created it. So if you're upstream, or if you're down, particularly if you're downstream, buying another company's product, lean on them to tell you what the export control jurisdiction classification is, and then double check it yourself. But the other thing I will add, because this often comes up, particularly with non-U.S. Based companies, is that every government wants you to do the self-classification, and as Ash said before, make sure you document that. Not just for good compliance purposes, but that is also your defense exhibit number one if the government disagrees with your self-classification. But there is a process in the United States called a commodity jurisdiction process, to where if a company just cannot determine they're like, look, we can't get below this. We would like to, but we can't really justify doing it. So they have to default to the higher level control, often ITAR, which means nobody wants to buy it around the world unless they have to. So, they run into that, and those are good candidates for going to the State Department's commodity jurisdiction team, which actually looks for any way they can to move it into the dual use space. So that's one thing to file away as a best practice, is don't jump to a CJ first, a commodity jurisdiction, do the self-classification first, but realize that there is a commodity jurisdiction process to backstop it. And I would assume there's a similar type process with the ECJU in the UK.
Yeah, definitely.
So thanks everyone for the answer. Sylvia, I hope that answers your question. We are over time, so really appreciate everyone's patience, but I thought it was definitely worth it to get those extra few words in. Really appreciate the expert insight. If you need any assistance, please check out the Chartered Institute's consultancy services. We put Ashley and Alan's contact details up on screen, and we'll share some more marketing details in the follow-up email, which will include the recording, so please feel free to listen that back and drop us a line. Otherwise, I think it's about time we gave you back your day. So thank you so much for all your patience and questions. I've just seen another question come in. Thank you, Sylvia. I'd like to extend special thanks to Womble Bond Dickinson, particularly Ashley and Alan, who very graciously agreed to be here today and for sponsoring this webinar. Otherwise, I hope you have a lovely rest of the day and enjoy the holiday season when it comes. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Take care. Cheers.
Thanks, Phil.